welcome back to EDH Deck Building. I am your host, Demo, and these are the commander staples that I will be putting in my Izzet decks. And this is an interesting one for me because I don't have an Izzet deck and I haven't really ever had one, to be honest. Whatever it is about the blue-red combination doesn't really attract me. I guess a lot of the commanders in there are doing the instant and sorcery sort of spell slinger theme, which doesn't really grab me. I'm more of a creature guy myself. I have made Izzet decks on my channel, obviously, in my Underwhelming Commanders series or in other aspects. I've made them for my patrons. Never actually had a paper Izzet deck for myself. For whatever reason, I've tried out a few commanders, nothing's really grabbed me. So talking about the staples here is going to be a little bit, I had to do a little bit of research for it. Now, whenever you're combining these colors, what's really important is thinking about what each color does well and what each color maybe doesn't do so well. Look at where the holes are that maybe you are missing when doing that color combination. And of course, being able to deal with what your opponents are doing is always going to be really important whenever thinking about that kind of thing. And of course, because you have blue, that means you have counter spells, and that's always going to be a huge boon for any deck because counter spells can deal with most things as long as the timing's right. Of course, you got to have that counter spell in your hand and you got to have the mana open when the situation arises. So having blue in your deck always gives you access to counter spells, which is always going to be great. Saw It Coming is one of my personal favorites, and An Offer You Can't Refuse has quickly become one of my favorites. And particularly good in a multicolored deck because, of course, Saw It Coming, you can foretell it and then just cast it for 1 and a blue, so you don't need a lot of blue mana, and An Offer You Can't Refuse only costs 1 blue. So you're not going to be caught up with having the appropriate colors of mana in a multicolored deck, where with a straight-up counter spell, which I might also play in a Izzet deck, has the blue-blue, so it might be a little more difficult, and you might have to be concerned. Again, you have to leave the mana open whenever you're casting counter spells. You're not going to be doing it on your turn, so you got to think about, okay, well, I have a counter spell in my hand, gotta leave that 2 blue open. If I have An Offer You Can't Refuse, then I only gotta leave the 1 blue mana open. It's less difficult for me to tap down that blue mana during my turn. So sometimes these counter spells that cost less blue mana when you're in the multicolored themes will make quite a bit of a difference. Of course, Vandal Blast, I'm gonna put in any red deck. Any deck that has red's gonna have Vandal Blast. It's the best artifact removal spell in the format. I really like Abrade as well. Man, I've become a huge fan of this guy. I like cards that are going to give me a modal aspect because you never know what your opponents are going to be doing, and being able to kill a creature with this or an artifact is really nice. There's always going to be an artifact around that you can kill with it, and having a creature with toughness 3 or less that you can kill is also going to be very likely. I still play Lightning Bolt in a lot of my decks, right? This is one of the best spells maybe in the history of the game. Just 1 red mana instant to do 3 damage to any target is fantastic. Even in a commander game, it's pretty fantastic. I think it's highly unlikely that you're ever going to go to your opponent's face with this. You could. If your opponent's only got 3 life left, you can just straight up win the game with this. Usually you're going to kill a creature, or you can even hit a planeswalker with this as well. So, you don't usually think about it that way, but doing damage to any target means it's planeswalker removal as well, which is great. So I would still put this in an Izzet deck. Of course, blue, surprisingly enough, is probably better at creature removal than red is. You got cards like Pongify and Rapid Hybridization, and it's always interesting. People have these discussions about which color's better at this or which color's better at that. And when you combine these colors, you got red and blue in a deck together, that's when you can kind of figure it out, because you're like, okay, well, what spot removal for creatures am I going to be putting in my Izzet decks? And you're probably going to be putting these two over anything that red can do. I also am almost guaranteed going to be putting Curse of the Swine in there as well, because I really like this. This is sort of a board wipe in a way, because you can hit X creatures. It exiles as well, which Izzet colors doesn't do very well, and you're always going to want exile options in your deck in case someone's got those indestructible creatures, or if you just don't want to be sending creatures to their graveyard all the time because they're playing a graveyard deck. So Curse of the Swine is probably one I'm going to play in an Izzet deck as well. And of course, when you get to the board wipes, blue doesn't have any creature board wipes, but red has great ones. Blasphemous Act, Chain Reaction, those are sort of my go-tos. Those are the first 2 that I'm going to put in a deck. In an Izzet deck, I'm always going to play at least these 2, and then also Curse of the Swine. So you're sort of covering all your bases here in an Izzet deck. deck with the counter spells, the artifact removal, the creature removal, the board wipes. You got a lot of bases covered. One base that you don't have covered very well is with enchantments. White and green are the only colors that really deal with enchantments efficiently, and if you're not playing either of those colors, you're going to have some struggles. And of course, if you're in an Izzet deck, you absolutely have to have Chaos Warp, because Chaos Warp is really going to be your only option for dealing with enchantments. It is one of the best removal spells in the game for that reason. If I'm in any deck that is red and isn't white or green, I'm going to be playing Chaos Warp for the sole reason that it deals with enchantments. Now, of course, it deals with any permanent, which is great. You can deal with lands, creatures, whatever. And in a pinch, if you're stuck, you can absolutely do that. Your opponent sneak attacks that Blightsteel Colossus into play, and they're going to swing and kill you. Instant speed, I Chaos Warp it. Great. But you got to put this in your Izzet deck for the sole reason that it deals with enchantments. Now, we do have another option here, though. Wild Magic Surge, which just came out in Baldur's Gate. Red and a red instant, destroy target permanent an opponent controls. Its controller reveals cards from the top of their library until they reveal a permanent card that shares a card type with that permanent. They put that card onto the battlefield and the rest on the bottom of the library in random order. So very similar to a Chaos Warp. You're destroying the permanent instead of shuffling it in. One of the good things about that, and one of the downsides of Chaos Warp, is you can actually get the same permanent back. I've seen it happen a few times. With Wild Magic Surge, there's zero chance you're going to get the permanent back. If you destroy your opponent's Smothering Tithe or the Heuristic Study, it's going to the graveyard and they're going to reveal something that isn't one of those cards, obviously, because they don't have another one in their library. So again, this is a red card that is dealing with any permanent type. And of course, again, it can work with lands and anything else, but mostly you're going to for sure want to put this in your Izzet deck because it deals with enchantments. And you really got to be able to deal with those enchantments in the Commander format. I also am going to put Liquimetal Torque in my Izzet decks as well. Put this on a lot of decks, but any deck that is going to have trouble dealing with a certain permanent type, and again, Izzet being a color combination that has troubles dealing with enchantments, I can now tap this to turn target non-land permanent into an artifact until end of turn. And of course, Izzet is not going to have any issue dealing with artifacts. So now if my opponent has that Smothering Tithe, I can just turn it into an artifact and destroy it with my Abrade or with my Vandal Blast. So this is a card, even though it's only tapping for colorless mana, I'm still going to find room for it in my Izzet decks. While we're talking about the mana rocks, I'm probably going to put Ornithopter of Paradise again. For me, any two-color deck, I'm probably going to put Ornithopter of Paradise in there. Unless you're playing green, then it's maybe iffy. I don't put a lot of mana rocks in my green decks. The fact that it's a creature can be a downside as a mana rock, but it can also be an upside. A lot of Izzet decks are playing artifact themes, so that reason as well, you might want to play it. I'm going to put it in my Izzet decks for sure. I'm probably also going to play Izzet Signet, and I haven't really talked about the Signets that much on this series. In a two-color deck, I like the Signets. I'm not as big of a fan as the Signets as a lot of other people are. For example, Ornithopter of Paradise, I'm going to put in a deck over any of the Signets. The fact that you have to put one mana into it can sometimes make things a little difficult in decks where you are playing lots of different colors, like 3 or 4 color decks. People like these because it gives you the colors you're looking for, but sometimes it doesn't give you the colors you're looking for. But in an Izzet deck, you don't have to worry about that, right? In a 2-color deck, I like these Signets because they are giving you exactly the colors you need. I'm not going to need any other colors other than blue and red. So I know my Izzet Signet is going to give me exactly the colors I need whenever I'm casting stuff. So I like the Signet series in 2-color decks. Now, as far as actual Izzet cards go, right? Cards that are actually blue and red. Again, I had to do some research because I don't make a lot of Izzet decks, and I had a hard time finding actual blue and red cards that I'm going to auto include in all of my Izzet decks. One for sure is Counterflux, blue, and a red instant. Counterflux can't be countered by spells or ability, counters target spell you don't control, and of course has Overload, and Overload is a fantastic mechanic. Pretty much every card that has Overload is good in the Commander format. 1 blue, and a red, so you're going to pay 1 more for this to counter all spells you don't control. Now, I myself have never used the Overload. It is nice to have that option. From time to time, it will happen where your opponents are all doing a bunch of stuff and you can cast this, and again, getting into how the whole stack works, if I cast this for its Overload cost after I have had a bunch of other opponents do stuff, I'm going to counter each spell I don't control. So all the spells on the stack that are currently on there, I'm going to counter all of them with this for 4 mana, which sometimes can be really, really good. The situation is rare, but it does happen. More so though, I really like this guy because it can't be countered, right? This is a 3 mana counter spell that can't be countered by your opponent's stuff, and I really like that. So having a counter spell in your deck that you know your opponents aren't going to be able to do hardly anything about, it's nice to kind of have that. There's a finality to it that sort of gives you some comfort in a game, right? Swerve is also a really good one that you could probably put in any Izzet deck. Just 1 on a red instant, change the target of target spell with a single target. Now, of course, you have access to counter spells, but this can be even better than a counter spell, obviously, because if your opponent casts a swords targeting one of your creatures, if you just counter it, then it just doesn't happen. But now it becomes a double whammy with this, because not only is it not going to target my creature, it's going to target your creature instead. So I'm now removing their creature off the battlefield, or maybe another opponent has a really troublesome creature that I want to get off the battlefield, and my opponent is going to help me here. And again, playing into the whole Izzet doesn't deal with enchantments very well, I can use this in that regard as well, where my opponent casts a Nature's Claim now, and they want to remove one of my enchantments off the battlefield, and I can now use this to get someone's troublesome enchantment off the battlefield, because Izzet doesn't do that very well. And everything I just said about this card also applies to Goblin Flectomancer, which I just love this card, and if I ever make an Izzet deck, this is going to go in there. I'm going to find room for it. Blue, red, red Goblin Wizard 2/2. Sacrifice Goblin Flectomancer. You may choose new targets for target instant or sorcery spell. So very similar to Swerve in what it's doing. Again, it's just going to redirect that spell to something else. It's fantastic value. The upside and downside to it both is that it is on the battlefield already. So the fact that it's on the battlefield already means that you can tap out, right? You can completely tap out. You don't have to save mana for a counterspell or for your Swerve. And if you're worried about your commander getting removed, now you have an option on the table to protect your commander, right? Or protect anything that you're worried about getting removed, because your opponent probably can't use targeted removal on that thing, or else you're going to redirect it at something else by sacrificing your Goblin Flectomancer, and it doesn't cost any mana. Now, of course, the downside is it's a creature on the battlefield that can just get blown out by some board wipe or something, but the upside and the downside sort of weigh each other out, I think. It's a really fun, interesting card, has really funny art as well. I like it a lot. It's a great card to throw in an Izzet deck, I think. Getting to the lands, and again, other than the usual suspects, Desolate Lighthouse is one that I think could probably go in any Izzet deck. Taps to add a colorless, but you can pay 1, a blue and a red, draw a card, then discard a card. So you're going to loot. And even if you're not in any kind of draw or discard theme at all, just I get rid of a card in my hand that I don't need. Like I just draw a mana rock or a land or something useless later in the game, and I just want to get some more gas. I get rid of that really useless thing and I get something a little more valuable. And in particular, in Izzet theme, again, you're going to be in a Spellslinger theme, so you're probably going to be leaving mana open a lot. Like 4 mana to loot is not great, but you're probably going to be leaving mana open a lot for the counter spells, the removal, the whatever. So if I don't need to do any of that stuff on my opponent's end step before my turn, I can just use that mana instead to loot. So I think this is a card that can go in any Izzet deck. And I will talk about one series of lands here that I again play in all my 2-color decks. And I believe we call this the check land series, right? Because it's checking for something that's already in play. Sulphur Falls being the Izzet option here. I put these lands in all of my 2-color decks. I like them a lot. It enters the battlefield tapped unless you control an island or a mountain, and taps for blue or red. So it's giving the 2 colors you need, and it's almost assuredly not going to come into play tapped. I mean, it's very, very easy to have an island or a mountain in play. Even early in the game, I will usually play a basic island or basic mountain or whatever on turn 1, and then on turn 2, you're good. That's it. You just need 1 island or 1 mountain, and this is going to come into play untapped. This is a fantastic series. I always put these in my 2-color decks. They're not very expensive. I really see almost no reason not to put them in your 2-color deck. So in an Izzet deck, I'm going to play Sulphur Falls for sure. But that is it. That is all. What are you guys putting in your Izzet decks? What are the auto includes for you whenever you're putting an Izzet deck together? Again, might mean the actual Izzet cards, or it might mean I'm in an Izzet strategy. I'm combining blue and red. What are the things that I need to worry about with that color combination, right? That also plays into combining these colors. Is certain color combinations don't do things well and do other things really well. So what are the things you're going to concentrate on? Whatever your guys' Izzet staples are, let me know in the comments below. But that is it for today, and thanks for tuning in.